gentlemen, my name is Heather Weiss, and I'm the Applications Coordinator for Magpie at the University of Pennsylvania. And Magpie is very pleased this evening to be partnering with the Gerda and Kurt Klein Foundation. We have 12 different colleges and universities connected this evening. Personally, I am very excited to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Mrs. Gerda Weissmann Klein. And I have to tell you a little story about how Magpie came to partner with the Klein Foundation and how I actually came to meet the wonderful woman sitting on my right that you're going to see in just a few minutes. About 3 years ago, when Magpie, we were first starting to put together our content programming for the universities and colleges and K-12s on our network, we were looking for providers and people to bring into our studios that we could use video conferencing technology and bring their message out to different schools. And I saw an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, actually my colleague Jennifer Oxenford did, and it was an address from Mrs. Klein to the United Nations. And it was so eloquently written that we just had to write her foundation to find out, gee whiz, would she be willing to talk to K-12 schools and colleges and universities and share her story? Luckily for us, she said yes. And this is actually our third program with Mrs. Klein, and I am very excited to say that I checked the numbers today, and we have actually reached more than 20,000 students using video conferencing technology and impacted more than 125 communities by sharing Gerda's story and challenging students in those communities to go out and make a difference and address a social or civil issue in their community. And to me, that is just wonderfully exciting. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, world-renowned motivational speaker, writer, Academy Award winner, scholar, and Holocaust survivor, Mrs. Gerda Weissmann Klein.
How can I possibly thank you, Heather and Jennifer, and above all, Nancy and Beth, who made my dreams possible through our foundation. To all of you who are here, my gratitude, my thanks. And it's almost impossible for me, who come from prehistoric times, when the thought of addressing universities throughout the country seem as far as the stars tonight. How can I start? What can I possibly say? Something popped into my mind earlier this evening while staying in the home of my friend Beth Reisport. I saw a copy of the first book which I have written. I haven't looked at it for years, and what caught me is what I'd like to try to quote for you now. It is the preface. And I wrote, as I finished the last chapter of my book, I feel at peace at last. I have discharged a burden and paid a debt to many nameless heroes resting in their unmarked graves. For I am haunted by the thought that I might be the only one left to tell the story. Happy in my new life, I have penned the last sentence of my past. I have written my story with tears and with love, and in the hope that my children, safely asleep in their cribs, should not awaken from a nightmare and find it to be reality. I was struck that I wrote those words almost 60 years ago. My children in their cribs, my grandchildren have outgrown their cribs and are adults now. Almost 60 years. And the hope that the great-grandchildren and your children and grandchildren will not awaken from a nightmare someday and find it to be reality is in a way a reality. We need only to turn on the news at night and find the horror of intolerance, of racism, of pain, discrimination, anti-Semitism, and all those ugly things which have caused so much pain. I look and see children, hungry children, with little cups in their hands. Can that still be? More than 60 years when I was a little girl? I wasn't such a little girl 60 years ago. I'm 83 years old. But a little over 60 years ago, I knew the joy of freedom again. My story is not unique. It happened to everyone at that time who was born in Europe, as I was. It is happening still, and this is what's the most painful thing, that it is happening still around the world. You are the messengers to a time I shall not see. And with great hope, you as the ones who were born with freedom, as you write, are going to see to it that perhaps someday my dreams and the dreams of all those who died for freedom will become a reality. Briefly, September 3rd, 1939, a brilliant Sunday morning, I was sitting with my parents, my brother, in our childhood home. It was a wonderful autumn when the world I knew and loved was finished forever. Similar, perhaps, to something you have seen not so terribly long ago. The shock of seeing a huge wave rising from an angry sea. It's called a tsunami. It swept away parents and children and grandparents, homes, one's childhood. This is what happened to me. A wave of hatred swept over Europe, called Nazism. It swept away my parents, as I said, my brother, my childhood home, and all but one member of my entire family. And I was alone on an empty, horrible beach. At least there was some comfort this time when the world reached out, when our country sent two presidents from opposing political parties in one plane to address themselves to the humanity and humanity's suffering. In my day, there was no one there. I was 15 years old. Shortly after, I was sold on the slave labors of Germany into a succession of slave labor and concentration camps. Slave labor because, you see, where I was born, which was on the border of Poland and Czechoslovakia, the part which used to be Austria before the First World War. Consequently, my first language was German, and then, of course, I went to Polish schools. But because we spoke German, they took the German-speaking girls to a succession of slave labor camps where they could teach us. In my case, it was weaving, and this is how we survived the first terrible time, 1942, because later on nobody went to slave labor camps anymore. As you well know, people went to Auschwitz. I know that when you hear the word Holocaust, I understand the pain, and perhaps some of you might have been reluctant to even listen to me tonight for the simple reason because one usually expects tales of horror of man's inhumanity to men, which will send you home to unspeakable nightmares. Unfortunately, all of it was true, but this is not what I'm going to talk about. I would like to address myself to